two tiny devices, side by side, together lighter than a single coffee bean. The parts inside them, a microphone, a small speaker, a basic processor, add up to a manufacturing cost of somewhere between $50 and $150. The price on the invoice at the audiologist's office is $4,800 for the pair. You've probably assumed that gap reflects something about the technology, years of research, some components so advanced it justifies the markup. It doesn't. The real explanation has almost nothing to do with what's inside the device, and almost everything to do with a regulation written in 1977 and 5 companies most people have never heard of, that quietly came to control 90% of a market that 48 million Americans depend on. Picture a small, windowless room. The walls are padded with foam. An audiologist sits across from you, running a hearing test that takes about 20 minutes. Beeps and tones through a pair of headphones, a button you press every time you think you hear something. When it's over, she shows you a chart, tells you, gently, that you have moderate hearing loss in both ears. It's common. It's not dangerous. It's why the television has gotten louder, why restaurants have started to feel exhausting, why your spouse thinks you're ignoring them when you're actually just not hearing them. Then, she opens a drawer and hands you 2 devices, each one smaller than a coffee bean, and tells you the price. For comparison, the smartphone in your pocket, with a processor, a camera, GPS, a touchscreen, and a battery that lasts all day, cost you around $800. The 2 hearing aids in your palm, containing a microphone, a small speaker, and a basic signal processor, cost 6 times that. You want to ask why. Most people don't. The audiologist is kind. She's a professional. And there's an assumption baked into the moment that a price this high must be tied to something real. The precision of the engineering, the years of research, the cost of getting a device this small to work reliably inside a human ear canal for years at a time. That assumption is doing a lot of quiet work in that room, and it's the same assumption that's kept this price standing for decades. To understand why, you have to go back more than a century, to a man who loved his wife. In 1904, a Danish businessman named Hans de Mont watched his wife gradually lose her hearing. At the time, the only real option was an ear trumpet, a metal cone held to the ear, barely better than cupping your hand behind it. De Mont traveled to the United States, brought back one of the first electronic hearing devices ever built, and watched it give his wife back the ability to hold a conversation. He was moved enough to start importing the devices to Denmark, so other people could have what she had. The company he founded eventually became Oticon, now part of the De Mont Group, the second largest hearing aid manufacturer in the world, with close to 30% of the global market. It looks on the surface like the origin story explains the price. A company built on genuine care, decades of refinement, real engineering heritage. That's the version that sounds complete. It isn't. 122 years later, that company, the one that started with a man wanting his wife to hear again, is part of a system, alongside 4 other companies, Sonova, WS Audiology, GN Hearing, and Starkey, that together control 90% of the global hearing aid market and 84% of the American one. And the reason that matters isn't heritage. It's what happens when 5 companies control a market with no outside pressure for 45 years straight. Until October of 2022, you could not legally buy a hearing aid without a prescription from a licensed audiologist. That rule came from a regulation written in 1977, when hearing aids were analog devices that genuinely needed professional calibration. The technology changed. Hearing aids went digital, programmable, no more complex than the wireless earbuds sitting in your desk drawer. The regulation didn't change with it. It stayed in place for 45 years, and during that time, the 5 companies grew, bought out competitors, and built something the earbuds market never needed. A business model that hides the price of the device inside the price of the service. Most audiologists use bundled pricing. The $4,800 you're quoted covers the hearing test, the fitting, the programming, and 1 to 3 years of follow-up adjustments, all rolled into a single number you can't break apart. You can't buy the device from one place and get it programmed somewhere else. An analysis published in 2023 found that bundled professional services account for 30 to 50% of the retail price, somewhere between $1,500 and $2,400 of that bill, going to the audiologist's time and the clinic's overhead. The devices themselves account for the rest, and the actual manufacturing cost of each one is $50 to $150. For a microphone that costs a few cents, a processor that costs a few dollars, a speaker driver that costs a few cents, and a battery that costs less than $1. Functionally, those are close to the same components sitting inside a $30 pair of wireless earbuds. The five companies don't just set that price, they control the whole chain around it. Sonova owns Audio Nova, a chain of more than 4,000 audiology clinics. Demant owns Hearing Life, hundreds of clinics across North America, and in 2022 bought a network of 500 clinics in China. The company that makes the device also owns the store that sells it, and in many cases, the audiologist recommending it. It's the same structure Luxottica used to dominate eyewear. Own the product, own the store, own the professional in the room, and the customer never sees the actual cost of anything. There's a reason none of this shows up in the news. You have never seen a Sonova commercial during a football game. You've probably never heard of WS Audiology. The brand names on the actual devices, Phonak, Oticon, Signia, Resound, Widex, are familiar only to the people who wear them and the audiologists who sell them. A monopoly that's invisible to everyone who doesn't personally need the product is a monopoly that never has to defend itself in public, because almost nobody outside the exam room is asking the question. This is a lot to sit with, and it's worth pausing on why it matters beyond the price tag. 80% of Americans who need hearing aids don't have them. Medicare, which covers most Americans over 65, doesn't cover hearing aids at all, which means the population that needs them most is also the population least able to pay for them. And the cost isn't only financial. Research published in The Lancet in 2020 identified hearing loss as the single largest modifiable risk factor for dementia, ahead of smoking, ahead of obesity, ahead of physical inactivity. When the brain stops receiving auditory input, the areas responsible for processing sound begin to atrophy, and the strain of constantly trying to hear pulls mental resources away from memory and reasoning. People with untreated hearing loss are significantly more likely to experience depression and social isolation. Someone stops going to dinner with friends because restaurants are too exhausting. They stop attending a grandchild's school event because they can't follow what's happening. The world gets smaller, one missed conversation at a time, not because the technology to prevent it doesn't exist, but because it's been priced out of reach. If stories like this, the quiet mechanics behind why ordinary things cost what they cost, are worth your time, the people who back this channel on Ko-fi are a big part of why we can keep digging into them properly. It's a small, no-strings way to say thanks, and it genuinely helps keep this kind of research going. The link is in the description. What actually changed things is that in October of 2022, the FDA created an over-the-counter category for hearing aids, and for the first time since 1977, adults with mild to moderate hearing loss could buy one without a prescription. Devices from companies like Jabra Enhance, Lexi, Sony, and a wave of Chinese manufacturers appeared at $200 to $800 a pair, averaging around $1,600, against an average prescription price of $4,600. As of 2025, only about 5.7% of people with hearing issues have tried an over-the-counter device. Adoption is still slow, but 70% of first-time buyers, the ones with no loyalty to the old brands, are already choosing the cheaper option. Factories in Shenzhen, the same manufacturing ecosystem that builds wireless earbuds for Apple and Samsung, are now producing hearing aids with a total bill of materials around $10 to $20, and a finished cost between $30 and $80 per unit. Built in certified clean rooms, tested to the same FDA protocols as the prescription devices. Sonova's stock has underperformed the broader market since the over-the-counter rule was announced. Demant has been buying up clinics to protect its service revenue. The five companies that never had to compete on price are now finding out what happens when someone finally does. Hans Demant brought a hearing device across an ocean because he wanted his wife to hear him. A century later, that same idea, restoring a basic human connection, ended up locked behind a $5,000 price tag by companies most people can't name. It's being unlocked now, not by a courtroom, but by a regulation that finally caught up, and a factory in Shenzhen that can build the same thing for the price of a nice dinner. If you want to see how this exact playbook played out in eyewear and in diamonds, and why hearing might be the industry where it finally breaks for good, that's exactly where we're headed next. None of this means the over-the-counter devices are a perfect substitute in every case. For someone with severe hearing loss, or someone who spends a lot of time in loud, complicated acoustic environments, a prescription device with more channels, better noise cancellation, and tighter Bluetooth integration still does something the cheaper device can't quite match. And that gap is real, not manufactured. But for the millions of people whose hearing loss is mild to moderate, whose main goal is hearing the television and following a conversation at dinner, the difference between a device that costs $79 and one that costs $2,400 is not a difference in whether they can hear again. It's a difference in whether they get to keep 3 months of retirement savings while they do it. That's the story, not hype, just the honest state of where things actually are. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.